The summer of 1973 hung heavy over Los Angeles like a suffocating blanket, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and tempers flare in the congested streets of Hollywood Boulevard. Henry Marlowe sat in a dimly lit diner on Sunset Strip, his fingers wrapped around a lukewarm coffee cup, watching the evening news play out on the grainy television mounted above the counter. Nixon's face flickered across the screen, speaking about Watergate, but Henry's attention was elsewhere, focused on his own reflection in the grimy window beside him. At 32, Henry possessed the kind of face that made people look twice. Sharp cheekbones, penetrating blue eyes, and a smile that could shift from charming to unsettling in a heartbeat. He'd learned long ago how to use that face, how to make people trust him, how to make them believe he was just another struggling actor trying to make it in the city of dreams. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores, with tired eyes and varicose veins showing through her support hose, refilled his cup without being asked. "You been in anything I might have seen?" she asked, the same question every aspiring actor in LA heard a dozen times a day. Henry's lips curved into that practiced smile. Not yet, but soon, very soon. What Dolores didn't know, what nobody in the diner knew, was that Henry Marlowe had already been in the newspapers 3 times that month. Not by name, of course. The press had dubbed him the Valley Strangler, though Henry found the moniker pedestrian and lacking imagination. 5 women in the San Fernando Valley, all discovered in their apartments, all bearing the same distinctive marks. The police were baffled, the public was terrified, and Henry was becoming something he'd never anticipated: famous. He paid for his coffee and stepped out into the sweltering evening air. The city pulsed around him with its usual chaos. Sirens in the distance, music spilling from nightclubs, the constant hum of traffic. Vietnam veterans sat on street corners, holding cardboard signs, their eyes hollow from experiences nobody wanted to hear about. The counterculture movement was dying, replaced by something harder, more cynical. It was the perfect time, Henry thought, for someone like him to thrive. His apartment in North Hollywood was modest, but meticulously clean. Every surface gleamed, every item had its place. Control had always been essential to Henry, even as a child growing up in rural Nebraska, where his father's belt had taught him lessons about power and pain that no child should learn. Those memories lived in him like splinters, working their way deeper with each passing year. The local news at 11 led with his story. Terror continues to grip the valley as police search for leads in the Strangler case, the anchor announced with appropriate gravity. Henry watched from his couch, noting how they'd gotten several details wrong. The incompetence might have angered him if it wasn't so useful. He reached for the notebook on his coffee table, the one where he kept newspaper clippings, and began adding the latest coverage to his collection. 2 days later, Henry stood outside the office of Marcus Goldberg, a B-movie producer known for exploitation films that capitalized on real-life horrors. The receptionist, a blonde girl who couldn't have been more than 20, smiled at him with perfectly white teeth. "Mr. Goldberg will see you now." The office reeked of cigar smoke and cheap cologne. Marcus Goldberg sat behind an enormous desk, his bulk barely contained by his leather chair. Movie posters lined the walls, lurid titles like Blood Beach Massacre and The Torso Murders. Henry had done his research. Goldberg had made a fortune turning tragedy into entertainment. "So, Henry Marlowe," Goldberg said, rolling the name around in his mouth like he was tasting wine. "My assistant says you've got a pitch that'll make us both rich." Henry leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Goldberg's face. "What if I told you I could give you exclusive insight into the Valley Strangler case? What if I could help you create the most authentic serial killer film ever made?" Goldberg's eyes narrowed. "You a cop? Reporter?" "Better," Henry said. "I'm someone who understands the psychology. I've studied these cases for years. I know how these men think, what drives them, what makes them tick." The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end, Goldberg was practically salivating at the possibilities. Henry had pitched it perfectly. A film that would blur the lines between fiction and reality, that would get inside the killer's head in a way no movie had done before. They shook hands, and Henry left with a development deal and a strange new feeling coursing through his veins. It wasn't just the thrill of the kill anymore. It was the intoxication of being seen, even if through a distorted lens. That night he drove through the valley, past the homes of his victims, past the police tape that still marked some of the scenes. The radio played Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, and Henry found himself humming along. He was no longer just Henry Marlowe, failed actor and successful killer. He was becoming something else, something the culture was creating without even knowing it. He was becoming a legend, and legends, he knew, never really died. The production offices of Goldberg Pictures occupied a rundown building in Burbank, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant that had opened after the fall of Saigon. By October 1973, the space had transformed into a hive of activity, with Henry at its center, consulting on every aspect of the film now titled Valley of Shadows. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was literally directing the narrative of his own crimes, shaping how the world would remember him. Sarah Chen, the young screenwriter Goldberg had hired, sat across from Henry in the conference room, her intelligent eyes studying him with an intensity that both thrilled and unnerved him. She was different from his victims, sharp, ambitious, unafraid. Her questions cut deeper than any police interrogation he'd imagined. "The killer in our script," she said, tapping her pencil against her notepad. "What do you think motivates him? It can't just be about power." Henry considered his words carefully. Perhaps he's looking for connection. Every kill is an attempt to feel something real in a world that's become plastic and fake. Look around us. Nixon lies to the nation. Corporations poison our food. Everything's falling apart. Maybe killing is the only honest thing left, Sarah wrote furiously, her dark hair falling across her face. That's brilliant. The killer as a product of societal decay. But there has to be more. What about his childhood? Abuse, Henry said without hesitation. But not just physical. Emotional starvation. A mother who was there but wasn't really there. A father who only knew how to communicate through violence. The killer learned early that pain was the only reliable currency of human interaction. Their sessions became a regular occurrence, and Henry found himself revealing truths he'd never spoken aloud, disguising them as creative insights. Sarah absorbed it all, weaving his darkness into something that resembled art. The more time they spent together, the more Henry felt an unfamiliar sensation, genuine attachment. It was dangerous, he knew, but also intoxicating in a way that killing had ceased to be. Meanwhile, the real investigation was intensifying. Detective Ray Morrison, a veteran cop with 30 years on the force, had begun to notice patterns the media missed. He visited the film set one afternoon, his presence sending a spike of adrenaline through Henry's system. "Interesting project you got here," Morrison said to Goldberg, but his eyes were scanning the crew, lingering on Henry. "Capitalizing on tragedy." "We're creating art," Goldberg protested, chomping on his ever-present cigar. "This film will help people understand." "Understand what? How to kill women." Morrison's voice was flat, controlled. "You're glorifying a monster." Henry stepped forward, extending his hand. "Henry Marlowe, consultant on the picture. I understand your concerns, detective, but we're trying to show the psychology behind these crimes, maybe help prevent future tragedies." Morrison's handshake was firm, his eyes never leaving Henry's face. "Consultant, huh? What makes you such an expert?" "Research. I've studied every major case since the Boston Strangler. It's fascinating how similar they all are, how predictable the patterns become once you understand the underlying pathology." The detective held his gaze for a long moment before turning away. "Just remember, this isn't entertainment for the families of those women." After Morrison left, Henry felt the familiar itch returning. The detective was smart, too smart, but the film was providing perfect cover. Who would suspect someone literally making a movie about the crimes? It was hiding in plain sight, the oldest trick in the book. Production began in earnest the following week. They'd hired an unknown actor named Jake Townsend to play the killer, but Henry found himself increasingly involved in shaping the performance. During one scene, where the killer stalked his victim through a parking garage, Henry demonstrated the walk, the way to hold the hands, the exact tilt of the head that would convey both menace and charisma. "It's like you've done this before," Jake joked, and everyone laughed except Sarah, who watched Henry with those penetrating eyes. The media began to pick up on the production. "Controversial film explores Valley Strangler case," read one headline. "Too soon?" asked another. The publicity was everything Goldberg had hoped for, and pre-sales were already exceeding expectations. Henry gave anonymous interviews as the expert consultant, his voice disguised but his insights chillingly accurate. One evening, as the crew wrapped for the day, Sarah approached Henry in the parking lot. The sun was setting, painting the smog-filled sky in shades of orange and red. "I know what you are," she said quietly. Henry's hand instinctively moved toward his pocket, where he kept a knife. "I don't know what you mean. You're not just a consultant. You've lived this somehow. The pain you describe, the anger, it's not theoretical." She stepped closer, and he could smell her perfume, something floral and innocent. "I don't think you're the killer, but you understand him in a way that scares me." "And yet you're not running," Henry observed, "because I need to understand too. For the script, for the film, maybe for myself." She touched his arm lightly. "Whatever darkness you're carrying, Henry, you can talk to me." It was an invitation and a trap, and Henry recognized both. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to tell someone the truth, to be seen for what he really was. The urge was almost as strong as the need to kill, and infinitely more dangerous. By January 1974, Valley of Shadows had wrapped principal photography, and Henry Marlowe had become something he'd never imagined: indispensable. Goldberg kept him on payroll for the editing process, valuing his unique insights into the killer's mindset. The rough cuts were disturbingly effective, and word began spreading through Hollywood's underground circuit that something special was being created in that run-down Burbank building. But success brought scrutiny. Detective Morrison had never stopped investigating, and his interest in the film production had evolved from professional curiosity to focused suspicion. He'd started interviewing crew members, asking about Henry's behavior on set, his knowledge of details that hadn't been released to the public. Henry knew the walls were closing in, but he couldn't help himself. The intoxication of seeing his story told, of watching audiences in test screenings lean forward in fascination rather than away in disgust, had become his new addiction. He'd killed twice more since production began, but these murders felt different, performative, as if he were acting out scenes for an audience that existed only in his mind. Sarah had become his closest confidant, though she still didn't know the complete truth. Their late-night script sessions had evolved into something more intimate, discussing philosophy, mortality, and the nature of evil over bourbon in her Silver Lake apartment. The walls were covered with research materials, crime scene photos, psychological profiles, newspaper clippings. It was a shrine to darkness that matched Henry's own collection. "The studio wants to add a redemption arc," she told him one night, rain pattering against the windows. "They think audiences need to see the killer show remorse." Henry laughed, a bitter sound. "Killers like this don't feel remorse. They feel ownership. Every victim becomes part of their story, their mythology. Remorse would mean admitting they were wrong, and they can't be wrong because then everything they've done becomes meaningless." "You sound like you admire him," Sarah said, studying his face in the lamplight. "I understand him. There's a difference." "Is there?" She moved closer on the couch. "Sometimes when you talk about him, your whole demeanor changes. You become someone else." The truth balanced on his tongue like a razor blade. He wanted to tell her everything, to finally drop the mask he'd worn his entire life. But before he could speak, the phone rang. It was Goldberg, panic in his voice. "The cops are here with a warrant. They want all our research materials, all the consultation notes." Morrison thinks someone involved with the production might be connected to the actual murders. Henry felt the familiar cold calm descend over him. "I'll be right there." He drove through the rain-slicked streets of Los Angeles, the city lights blurring through the windshield. The radio was playing news updates about the impeachment hearings, about a nation losing faith in its institutions. How fitting, Henry thought, that his own unraveling would coincide with the country's. The production office was swarming with police when he arrived. Morrison stood in the center of it all, directing the search with military precision. When he saw Henry, something shifted in his expression. "Mr. Marlowe, good of you to come. We'll need to ask you some questions." "Of course, anything to help." They sat in Goldberg's office while officers boxed up materials outside. Morrison pulled out a notebook, his movements deliberate and measured. "Where were you on the night of December 15th? Working on the film. We had a late editing session. Anyone who can verify that?" "The editor, Tom Walsh. We were here until almost 3 in the morning." Morrison made a note. It was true. Henry had made sure to establish alibis for his recent kills, but the detective wasn't really interested in December 15th. "You know what I find interesting, Mr. Marlowe? You showed up in LA just 2 weeks before the first murder. No acting credits, no industry connections, but suddenly you're the expert on serial killers. I've been studying, so you've said, but studying and knowing are different things. The way you described the killer's methods in your consultation notes, it's like you were there." Henry met his gaze steadily. "Good imagination. That's why they hired me." Morrison leaned back. "Maybe, or maybe you're him, the Valley Strangler. Maybe this whole film is your way of celebrating what you've done." The accusation hung in the air between them. Henry felt a strange peace wash over him. This was it, the moment of truth he'd been unconsciously orchestrating since the beginning. "If I were him," Henry said slowly, "wouldn't making a film about it be incredibly stupid? Why would I put myself in the spotlight? Because you're narcissistic. Because you need the attention. Because killing isn't enough anymore. You need to be celebrated for it." Every word was true, but Henry just smiled. "That's a fascinating theory, Detective. Very cinematic. Maybe you should be consulting on the film." Morrison's jaw clenched. "This isn't a game, Marlowe. 5 women are dead." "7, Henry corrected automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, based on the pattern, there are probably 2 more you haven't found yet." The detective's eyes sharpened. "What makes you say that?" Henry's mind raced. Statistical probability. Serial killers rarely stop at 5. "Check abandoned buildings in North Hollywood, particularly near the old railroad tracks." Morrison stood abruptly. "Don't leave town, Mr. Marlowe. We'll be talking again soon." After the police left, Goldberg was ecstatic. "This is incredible publicity. The cops think someone involved with the film might be the actual killer. We'll make millions." But Henry wasn't listening. He was thinking about Sarah, about Morrison, about the 2 bodies that would soon be discovered exactly where he'd suggested. He was thinking about how the story would end, not the film's story, but his own. The real question was whether he would write that ending himself, or let others write it for him. The bodies were discovered on a cold February morning, exactly where Henry had suggested. Detective Morrison stood at the crime scene, watching the coroner's team work, his mind racing with the implications. Henry Marlowe had known where to find victims that had been dead for months. There were only 2 possibilities. He was psychic, or he was the killer. Henry watched the news coverage from Sarah's apartment, her presence beside him both comforting and electric with tension. She hadn't spoken much since the discovery, but he could feel her processing, analyzing, coming to conclusions she didn't want to reach. "You knew," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew where they'd be." "I told you, I understand patterns." "Stop!" She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "Just stop. I've been going over everything, every conversation, every detail you knew that wasn't public. The way you demonstrated the killer's walk. The specific dates you always had alibis for. God, Henry, tell me I'm wrong." The moment stretched between them, fragile as spider's silk. Henry could lie, could maintain the facade, but looking into Sarah's eyes, he found he didn't want to anymore. The performance was ending. "You're not wrong," he said simply. She should have run, should have screamed, should have done anything but what she did. She stayed seated, her journalist's instinct overriding her survival mechanism. "Why?" she asked. "Because I could. Because it made me feel real in a world full of facades. Because every single person pretends to be something they're not, and I got tired of pretending to be normal when I was anything but." The film. Was it all just ego? Henry laughed, but there was no humor in it. The film was supposed to be my monument, my way of ensuring I'd be remembered. But then something changed. Working with you, creating something from the darkness, it became about more than just me. You killed 7 women, Henry. 7 women who had families, dreams, futures. I know their names, their faces, their last words. They're part of me now, forever. Is that not a kind of immortality? Sarah's hand moved toward her purse, where Henry knew she kept a small recorder. He made no move to stop her. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked. "No," Henry said, and he meant it. "You're the only person who's ever really seen me. Killing you would be like killing the only witness to my existence." The phone rang, shattering the moment. Sarah answered, listened, then handed it to Henry. "It's Goldberg. Henry boy, you need to get down here right now. The studio loves the rough cut. They want to fast-track release. We're going to premiere at the Chinese Theatre. Can you imagine? Your vision on the biggest screen in Hollywood." Henry agreed to come, hung up, and looked at Sarah. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to call Morrison right now. Part of me wants to finish what we started, to complete the film. And if you do, if you let me finish this, then I'm complicit. Then I become part of your story." They drove to the studio separately, Henry knowing this might be his last day of freedom. Morrison had called 3 times, but Henry hadn't answered. He could feel the detective closing in, could sense the net tightening. The screening room was packed with studio executives, their faces glowing with anticipation and greed. The film played, and Henry watched his story unfold on screen, sanitized, dramatized, but essentially true. Jake Townsend had captured something essential in his performance, a hollowness behind the eyes that Henry recognized from his own reflection. When the lights came up, the room erupted in applause. Goldberg was already talking distribution deals, merchandising, maybe even a sequel. Henry stood in the back, observing it all with detached fascination. They were celebrating him without knowing it, turning his sickness into entertainment, his victims into plot points. Sarah found him in the hallway afterward. "Morrison is here," she said. "He's waiting in the lobby with a warrant for your arrest." Henry nodded. "I know. I saw his car outside. You could run. Where would I go? This was always how it was going to end. The only question was whether the film would be completed first." She pulled out a manila envelope from her bag. "The final script revisions. The ending you wanted. The killer walking away into the crowd, becoming myth rather than man. I wrote an alternative. The killer caught, revealed as pathetically human, stripped of all mystique. Which one will you use?" "That depends on what you do next." Henry understood. He could go quietly, let them arrest him, stand trial, become another Teddy Bundy or Charles Manson, a celebrity monster for the masses to simultaneously fear and fetishize. Or he could take control of his narrative one last time. He walked toward the lobby, Sarah following. Morrison was there with 4 officers, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Henry Marlowe, you're under arrest for the murders of Detective Morrison," Henry interrupted, his voice carrying across the lobby where industry people were beginning to gather, sensing drama. "Before you do that, there's something everyone should know. He turned to face the growing crowd, recognizing several reporters who'd been invited to the screening. This was his stage, his moment, his final performance. The film you just watched, the story you're about to make famous, it's all true. I am the Valley Strangler. I killed those women, and all of you are about to make me immortal. The lobby erupted in chaos. Cameras appeared from nowhere, flashbulbs exploding like fireworks. Morrison's officers moved forward, but Henry didn't resist. As they cuffed him, he looked back at Sarah one last time. "Which ending?" he asked. She held up the envelope, then slowly tore it in half. "Neither. I'm going to write a new one where the monster doesn't get to control his own story." As they led him away, Henry could hear Goldberg already spinning the story to reporters, smell the excitement in the air, feel the myth beginning to form around him. He'd wanted to become legend, and in a twisted way, he'd succeeded. But Sarah was right. He wouldn't control how that legend was told. 6 months later, Valley of Shadows premiered to massive controversy and record-breaking box office numbers. Henry watched the news coverage from his cell on death row, seeing his story transformed into something he barely recognized. Sarah had rewritten the ending completely. The killer captured not through his own grandiosity, but through the patient work of a dedicated detective and the courage of a woman who chose justice over art. The film ended with the victims' names, their photos, their stories. They were the ones remembered, while the killer became merely a shadow in the valley of their light. It wasn't the immortality Henry had imagined, but perhaps it was the one he deserved. Forever captured, but never truly seen, a cautionary tale about the danger of turning monsters into myths. In his cell, Henry Marlowe smiled his last, genuine smile. He'd wanted to become a movie icon, and he had, just not in the way he'd planned. The culture that created him had also consumed him, turning his darkness into entertainment while stripping away everything that made him feel special. He was just another monster in a long line of monsters, his story told by others, his legacy out of his control. The serial killer had indeed become a movie icon, but in the end, the movie became something greater than him. A mirror held up to a society that couldn't look away from its own darkness, even as it claimed to despise it.